So this is exciting. I think this is a little exciting.
I think it's very exciting.
Also, it's so hot. I had never been to New Orleans, and I was like, oh my God, it's really hot here.
You're baptized.
I was like, wow, okay, and very humid. Now, that's the end of the me complaining about the weather part of this interview. I'm so excited to have Griffin here. It's funny because it's like I'm trying to think of the right way to introduce you, and I think I keep getting stuck on like icon. Sorry.
No, I'll take it.
I apologize. An actor, a producer, a writer, and now a memoirist. So my first question is always when I interview people about their books is like, how did you get here? Like, when did you decide you wanted to write this? What was this sort of moment? Because you are in certain ways like a very private person, I think. I don't know you that well, but I did read your book. And I did feel like this was not your first impulse.
No, I had been thinking of it for some time, and I'd always sort of kept notes in the eventuality I might write a book, because kind of like amazing, almost unbelievable things have happened, either to me or someone in my family, from family history, with all sorts of like just crazy marriages and divorces and behavior, and some of it's really, really funny, and some of it's, has been quite sad. And so I've been keeping sort of a tab of, particularly the funny stuff that I would tell, over dinner, and I go, oh, that went over well. I got to remember that. And when I made a documentary about my aunt, Joan Didion. And when I was cutting that together, and I went into her family history, I got the idea of a structure for the book, of having it, not knowing the title, but knowing the subtitle was a family memoir.
Yeah.
And that would take my family history, going back on my mother's side to the Mexican Revolution, where Pancho Villa drove my mother's side of the family to Nogales, Arizona, in the border town. And the Great Famine that brought my father's family from Ireland. And from the moment they arrived in America, some really crazy stuff happened, and there were stories I grew up with that my mother would tell me, of my great-grandmother finding out, that her husband had died while she's in bed with her lover, and say, I'm a widow, you want to come to the funeral? So that's that side. Then my father's childhood, and I really just started chronologically beginning in the 18th century and just sort of worked my way up. And it just sort of, there were just stories that I was the only one left to really recount them.
Yeah.
And, as I got further into, in the early 80s, a lot of tragedy happened. I didn't think I would be dealing with that, and because I did keep that quite private, and my father, Dominic Dunne, wrote quite extensively about a trial process that we went through in the judicial system and victims' rights, but it hadn't been told from a sibling's point of view. So I just kept plowing through, just to have a record, and there's, I'm on a text chain with a lot of Dunnes and Burns on my father's side, and they were asking about an obscure relative on my mother's side from Mexico, and one of them went to chat GBT, and suddenly there's the entire biography of this guy, and it's from my book.
Oh, wow.
It's practically quoted. So at least, it's public record. I mean, now everybody knows who Senor Sandoval is.
That's very annoying.
Yeah.
Speaking of very annoying, while I was reading this book, I was texting you, which I think is very annoying. But
You were reading and texting?
I was reading it and texting you and being like, oh my God, my mom did the very same thing. And which I think must be quite annoying. I feel like I don't have enough friends, so while people are reading my book, they're not, or maybe my book is so short that they're not texting me. But what I was struck by when I was reading it was you did so many things so lovingly. You wrote about your family in a very loving way. And there were a lot of things that, like, it was clear to me that as you talked about what happened to your sister and your father writing about it, you had mixed feelings.
Yeah.
But you were able to write about it in a very loving way. So can you explain to us a little bit about how you were able to do that and why you did it? Because it felt very careful and intentional. And I feel like I've read a lot of memoirs right now where they do that, where it's very careful and intentional and kind in a way that it might not have been in other periods in American life.
Well, the only surviving member of my immediate family is my younger brother. And if I was to write a family memoir, I had to write about his mental struggles. He was bipolar. He's fine now, but he suffered enormously, and we all suffered for him. And so I couldn't write it without his permission. And so I called to say, listen, I'm thinking of doing this, but I have to write about this period in your life. It's not going to be all about that because he's brilliant on so many ways and so funny, but I have to deal with that. And he thought for a moment, and he said, you can write about me whatever you want. Just have it come from a place of love. And I thought, oh, that's a great note for the entire book. And it gave me permission to write about, my father was, until he really found his purpose in life, he was very flawed. And I could write about, his alcoholism and his closeted life, and as much as I knew, and his self-destruction, because I knew where I was ending. I knew my ending. I knew his path was incredible, and I felt that way about all my family. So I was able to write about my own flaws as well, and my own journey, and I just sort of, and I thought of in the epitaph at the beginning of the book, I used a line of my dad, and it applied to all of us. When I was upset with my father about something or other, he said, "What can I say, kid? I'm just a work in progress." And everybody in this book, in my family, is.
Yeah, and it's really a lovely, lovely book. One of the other things that, as someone who, I got sober when I was 19 and came from a family with a lot of alcoholism, so I've written about alcoholism a lot. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this book was you write about alcoholism and addiction. You're not an alcoholic, but in a very kind of compassionate way. And you also sort of get it right. So I'd love you to talk about that, because that's a very difficult needle to thread.
Yeah, there was, there's a lot of alcohol in the book, and it's consumed and has effects on different behavior of different people in my family. And, I think as a child, I didn't think of my father as an alcoholic, as a slurring kind of drunk guy ranting around the house. He was angry and meticulous and kind of superficial, but I didn't see until I was late in my teens, when he got sober, just how alcohol really destroyed his life.
Yeah.
And his rabid pursuit to become sober and to think about a higher power. I mean, AA really saved his life, and he became a sponsor to others. And it really prepared him for the life that he was going to lead ahead. And, I remember, when his daughter, my sister, was murdered, I remember him saying, you know, if I hadn't if I don't start drinking now, I don't think I ever will. And he didn't. And it was, so it wasn't so much about, you know, lifting a glass and drinking. It was more about the blowback effects that that alcohol had on his life and post-sober life, you know?
Yeah. No, you write so well about him. You know, he goes to I mean, explain what happens to him, because it's just fascinating. And also your relationship with him is so interesting during that period.
Yeah, he was, when we were growing up, he was very, very social. And he grew up loving movie stars. And his ambition was to be friends with movie stars, and particularly of the movies that he grew up with. And he got his wish, and he became like, he and my mother were real socialites in Los Angeles. And they gave enormous parties. And he was so important about, you know, who was coming to his home. And he was a television executive, and television and movies did not interlink in those days. So no one could quite understand how he pulled it off, just by his, I guess, sheer charm and ambition to be a starfucker, I guess. You know, that blew up in his face. He became kind of he was saying things socially that were getting him in trouble, and he wasn't fooling anyone with being closeted. But the worst sin was that when he became a movie producer, his films were failures. That's the biggest sin. And all these people who he partied, who drank his liquor and he had to his home, they all dumped him. And he lost all his money. My mother divorced him, and he ended up having a yard sale from his apartment, selling all these objects he treasured so much, you know, endirons and ashtrays from great hotels and rugs, and put tags on them. And the same people that drank his booze came and haggled with him. And then he got in a car afterwards with the money and the few possessions he kept, and he drove. He had a beautiful 1965 Mercedes, which he sold, and drove up the coast of California in a Ford Fiesta until it broke down in Oregon in front of like a cabin, cabins for rent. And he lived in that cabin, drove on windy roads to an AA meeting every day for 12-mile road. And he taught himself how to write. And he taught himself really through letters to us, to his family, to my brother, sister, and I. These 15 single-space typed letters. And they were like workshops for him to like find his voice as an author. And he, after a while, he got one of the people. He gave a party called the Black and White Ball, and it was a huge event. And Truman Capote came. In Cold Blood had just come out, and he was an enormous celebrity. And a year later, Truman gave a Black and White Ball of his own and didn't invite my father. And so, after he'd been in this cabin for about a year, out of the blue, Truman Capote writes him a letter. And he says, I know what you're going through. I know what shame is. I know what it's like to be exiled. But that is not where you belong. You've got to come back and face yourself and get back into the game of life. And that's what he did. And he came to New York. He lived in an apartment down the street from me that was smaller than the very first apartment I ever had in New York when I was a waiter, without a complaint. And he ended up writing his first novel, The Two Mrs. Grenvilles. It became a bestseller.
You write a lot about being a waiter in a very wonderful way. And you talk about how you had this friendship. It's funny because I have a very naughty friend who writes for the New York Times, and he was like, I want to know about the Carrie. He was actually like, you have to ask him about Madonna. So, but I'm going to ask you about Madonna. Should I ask him about Madonna now? Yes. Okay. So I said, what about Madonna? And he said, oh, now this is what he told me. I know you're going to know who this friend is as I describe it, but he said, if you did a movie with Madonna, and I don't know if this is true, so don't quote me, that Madonna always sort of propositions you. And if you're handsome, like you are. And that if you say no, it's okay, but that she does. So here's the question. I think this is a pretty good question, right? I mean, yeah.
Very literary.
Yes, very. That's right. Thank you. Very literary. Madonna.
Did she hit on me? Is that the question?
Yes, that's the question.
I think it is a rite of passage.
Yes.
But she, you know, I don't know how serious it was, but she was married to Sean Penn, who I knew and understood his temper. And I also knew enough about the media that if we were caught, my wiki page in the future would forever, that would be the opening paragraph. You know, I caught cheating with Madonna. So that, you know, we worked our way through that. But we had a lot of fun. I mean, she's hilarious. And I don't know, you know, as I said, I grew up in Los Angeles and a lot of movie stars came to the house and all that kind of, I've never seen stardom like this. And it didn't look appealing at all.
Yeah.
She handled it great. I mean, if we were outdoors, I could barely hear her because there were so many helicopters overhead, you know, trying to get pictures of her. We had to loop all the exteriors because there were so many press. And everywhere you looked, there was these long lenses. And we were followed by follow cars and we just went out to dinner. But she handled it great. But it was kind of, you know, I deal with my own conflict with success and fame, you know, later on in the book. And that sort of stayed in my mind of like, that looks really scary.
Yeah.
That doesn't look like fun.
Yeah.
But she had great aplomb and was hilarious. We had a good time.
Yeah, you have, you know, my father had a famous father around the same vintage as a little older than your father, but had a similar kind of, was very conflicted about what came from it. The sort of Hollywoody, growing up in Hollywood, I think it's tough, as opposed to growing up in New York, which is totally normal. But I'm wondering, one of the wonderful things in this book that's so incredibly sweet is you talking about your relationship with Carrie Fisher, and your friendship, and just, and also your anxiety about living with her and her rise to fame. So talk about that.
Yeah, we met when I was 16 and she was 15. My brother had met her before, and he said, I met the woman I'm going to marry, and I love her, and turned to me and said, and don't you talk to her. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, don't do that Charles Boyer, Pepe Le Pew thing. Don't make her like you. And so I kept my mouth shut. She came over to the house, and she was hilarious. And I kept trying to suppress, you know, my smart-ass comments coming back at her. I mean, and then my mom said, will you drive Carrie home? And so I get in I just got my driver's license. She gets in the driver's seat, and I go, what are you doing? She goes, teach me to drive. And she just drives the car onto people's lawns singing Some Enchanted Evening. And a friendship was born. And when I moved to New York, she followed, not me necessarily, but she came to New York and wanted to be an actress and do what I was doing, which was really waiting on tables. But and we were roommates, and just every day was just hilarious. She's the funniest person I ever knew. And then she said one day, you know, I got this part in a movie, and it shoots in England, so you're going to be alone for a while, you know. And yeah, I was working at Radio City Music Hall as a popcorn concessionaire, And he
Which
goes,
you write about actually
Yeah.
so well. It's
Well, I
very
did love
lovely.
that job.
Yeah.
And she goes, so you can fuck all the Rockettes you want in my bed. Not that I did. But,
Well, you sort of did.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, and I said, well, what's the movie? You know, suddenly very competitive. And she goes, oh, you wouldn't be interested. It's going to star this guy named Harrison Ford. I went, Harrison Ford? He was a carpenter at my aunt and uncle's. He built the deck at my aunt and uncle's house. I love that guy. He's like a hero to me. And another guy named Mark Hamill. Who's he? Well, he's about your age, but you wouldn't want this part. And so, of course, the movie was called Star Wars.
Perhaps you've heard of it.
And she would call me from New York, from London, waking me up, and go, "Oh my God, this movie is such a turkey." You know? We spend our days. We're on sound stages, and we're running with this like big ape following us, and there's this little guy in a trash can rolling along with us. And we have ray guns with no triggers, and and I have bagels on the side of my head. This is going to be the biggest turkey ever. I can't believe. And we went to the Ziegfeld to see the very first screening, and it was not a turkey. And it was the first time I'd ever had a really close friend become like overnight famous. And I was still at Radio City Music Hall, you know, and suddenly as what comes with stardom is a lot of hangers-on and a lot of drugs and a lot of famous people and musicians that I'd grown up idolizing, you know, James Taylor and Paul Simon, and I just thought, you know, what am I doing here? This isn't my place to be. You know, I'm not ready for this. She's earned it. I haven't done anything. Why am I hanging around with these people? So I left. I moved and got into a more appropriate, you know, shitty little East Village apartment and tried to catch up with her, you know, professionally. And, you know, it was a bump in the road, but our friendship picked up, you know, not long after.
It's funny because as someone who also grew up in a similar milieu, though different, I'm impressed that you didn't feel entitled at all. You know, because a lot of children of famous or fame adjacent people have a kind of entitlement that their parents' accomplishments are their own. And I'm impressed that you were able to see that.
Yeah, I think, you know, I was raised in Beverly Hills, which was a source of tremendous shame to me. The Beverly Hillbillies was, you know, the #1 show. And every time I'd be outside, I'd had to be pressured into saying, well, yeah, not West LA, but yeah, Beverly Hills. And they go, do you know the Beverly Hillbillies? And I go, no, I don't. And it just being, you know, kind of where it's just assumed you're a rich kid and you live off your parents.
Right.
It's what drove me to New York to get my own thing going. And, you know, I didn't think it was cool. I wanted, you know, just to like have my own identity and not be tied to a town or from Hollywood or that kind of thing. So I think that played into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting, it's just interesting to watch. Carrie Fisher, I think of her as like just sort of a singular human. You don't talk to us about sort of your last phone call with her and, you know.
Well, you know, people very close to her, she had the most loyal friends ever. And there was a group of about 6 or 8 people. And to this day, we're all on the same text thread. Whenever a funny thing that Carrie says comes to mind, we'll bring it out, which will lead to long conversations where each of us are trying to be funnier than the other. And but in this, particularly in this circle, we also worried about her, and she made no secrets of her struggle with mental health issues, with drugs, and she'd just be in and out. She would go to the program. She had a sponsor, and then she wouldn't, and but none of us were really. None of us spoke to her, in the last week of her life, thinking that we were not going to be speaking to her ever again. And as I remember the conversation, our children, our daughters are the same age, and they've known each other since they were born. And I think we were just doing daughter gossip, and just being funny and kind of glib. And I'm going to London, and I'm going to see so and so, oh, that'd be good. Say hi, blah blah blah, and then we know what happened, on that plane. And I was in New York, and I flew immediately to Los Angeles, where she landed, and I went to Cedars-Sinai, where she was on life support, and where I had been before.
Right, second time.
The second time, probably the same floor. And it was, just so shocking. And some people say it was inevitable, which really bothered me, but you're never expected. It was just so shocking.
Yeah. One of the things that you write about so well are I think of you as like a cockeyed optimist when it comes to love. And you've had, a lot of beautiful girlfriends, wives, but you write about them in such a lovely way. Talk to me about how you wrote about these romances. I think it's very sticky. My mother ruined her second husband's life by writing about him in Fear Flying. So I always think about how do you sort of do this without carnage? So discuss.
Yeah. I don't know. For shrinks will have to understand why I was born just kind of girl crazy. I just always wanted a girlfriend. I was the first in my elementary school to like girls. And so I don't know. I still do. And I would, at that, as a young age in my teens, and I would fall in love. And the most outrageous sort of thing that happened, which is on my IMDb and Wiki page, is when I was 17, I eloped to Tijuana with a girl I was in love with, and came back and told we weren't going to tell my parents, but right away. And my dad, as soon as I got in, he called and said, "Hey, what's new today? We just come back from Tijuana. We just spent like 50 pesos on a life-binding, no kissing, no do you take this ring." It was a competition of who loved the other more, so it was a dare that would follow us the rest of our lives.
Like all great marriages are built on.
Yes, they're all dares. Yeah. And anyway, he said, "Hey kiddo, how was your day today? What'd you do? Anything new?" And no. And then he proceeds to tell me about this beautiful wedding he just came back from a guy not much older than me. He goes, "That's the kind of marriage I want to give you. That's what I want." I went, "Why is he telling me this?" And so I came clean, and I told him. And both parents were devastated. And then we moved into an apartment and pretended we were adults and ate frozen dinners. And I'd go, "Oh my God, this is so delicious. Did you make?" And we were sitting on cardboard boxes, just pretending to be grown-ups. And I think that, we watched our parents pull this off unsuccessfully. So we thought we would, be, something out of Leave It to Beaver or something. And of course, that didn't last. I don't mean to spoil alert. But we did have a real professional divorce. And her family hired the most high-powered lawyers. And
You were at the time a waiter.
And I was actually a shipping clerk at Williams-Sonoma.
Yes.
And I was making $1.50 an hour. And her high-powered lawyers, one of which I would eventually see, I don't know how he's crossed this Rubicon, sitting behind Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearing.
Yes.
But that's the level of lawyer they got.
Yeah.
And mine came from the Yellow Pages. And the lawyer said that they were after 1/2 of my $1.50 an hour. And the judge said, he took a moment, he said, I've been sitting at this bench for a long time, and never in my entire history have I seen more ridiculous people in my courtroom. You will not get a penny from this boy. Divorce granted.
It's really a great story. I mean, it's just an adorable story of, but I think so. You've written this book. I want you to sort of explain to us how as someone who's written books, I always feel a little bit like I want to die afterwards. I actually always feel like that. I think I'm a little depressed, but I'm wondering if you can. How do you feel about this book, about writing it, about this sort of experience? I feel like people love it as well.
Yeah.
They should.
Well, it's funny you would say that you wanted to die, because I felt when I finished it, I went through a period of mourning.
Yeah.
The family that's no longer with me, who I did write about with love, and their entire histories, and I'd just been with my parents since the time they were born and all the way through their lives. And I went through a period of mourning all over again. And I missed the damn book so much when I turned it in. I just wanted to go back to the family. They were never more alive. It was, and then I've learned from, doing projects and acting and producing and all the different things, of which each movie, it goes through your head, this is going to be a huge hit. This is going to be, and I've tempered that. I've gone the other way. I'm not that optimist. You talk about it, I go, well, this is going to, I just temper my feelings and have no expectations. And this is beyond, the reception is like everything I could have hoped for from so many people who knew nothing about my family and would write and tell me how much they fell in love with my family. To my friends who thought they knew me but didn't know. And it's been an incredible journey this past year. I've never really experienced anything like it. And the fact that it's a book, it's such a solo flight, Everything I'd done before is with collaborators and so many people involved. But this I feel, really proud of. It's like something I started and finished.
Yeah. Well, you should be really proud of it. And it is, yeah. Do you think, I love, one of the things that I love about this book, because my grandparents lived in Old Hollywood, and there's so much of old Beverly Hills in there, the Beverly Hills of, sort of dilapidated, but still very luxurious. And there's so much of sort of the world we don't live in anymore. There's a kind of collective sadness about that. Is that a function, because I have that too. Do you think that's a function of sort of memoir itself, or of our, getting into the sort of second half of our lives? I don't even want to say that, but since I'm much, much, much younger than you are. But,
Wow.
you know, just kidding. Actually, I am. Go on.
Well, there is. I think it's sort of inherent as a memoir. Obviously, you're writing about the past, and the past of Beverly Hills that I wrote about doesn't exist anymore. As it was as much as embarrassed as I was at the time to be from it. I would look back and go, God, it was really like a little community. It was like a colony, and everybody did know each other, and you knew the people in the stores. It was very Bedford Falls, kind of community, and there was old Hollywood, and there was, and the movie stars, the ones that came to our house, had sort of passed their peak. Their greatest work was in the 30s and 40s and part of the 50s, and in the 60s, these incredible men like William Wyler and Billy Wilder, and they were, at the tail end of their time. So when you look back, it's sort of a world that doesn't exist, because I have the perspective on it. But there probably is some kid in Beverly Hills who's going to write a memoir, 20 years from now, and wax on about the Starbucks that was on Rodeo. It's just constantly moving. But there is I felt that very much when I was writing it. The very not nostalgic, but just sort of how it was a place in time that was never ever going to be captured again.
Yeah, it's funny because in my book, which is coming out in June, everybody my husband gets cancer and we're all very depressed, and I take my children to the happiest place on earth, the Beverly Hills Hotel, and so I just, even though it very much not, but it got me thinking about this sort of old, and my grandparents used to live in what is now the parking lot, right? In one of those little houses when there were still little houses in Beverly Hills.
Yeah, and there was 20th Century Fox, is now Century City, and there are all these, we would drive on our way to the airport. We would always pass these burning cinders that went high up into the sky, like a devastated fire took place, and it's where the burning of Atlanta took place in Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
And it was still there in like 1966, 67. We go, oh, there's the Gone with the Wind, the burning of Atlanta, and we would recount, my dad or my mom would say, oh, that night, they weren't there, but that night was an incredible night where Selznick had everyone in Hollywood came and they watched the whole set burn to the ground. It was like one of those great evenings and people all celebrated. And so I kind of grew up with those kind of stories and those landmarks.
One of the things I think about a lot is this idea that a happy childhood, you're obsessed with the nostalgia of getting it back, and an unhappy childhood you can never get out of. This has been my experience. You can guess where I am. And I wonder if you think that's true, and if that has sort of, because it seems like you had, in a lot of ways, a very happy childhood.
Yeah, I did, because I never didn't feel loved. What came to me at an early age, though, because of divorce and different things of my parents, I saw them at a very early age as humans who were struggling, and they might have had other priorities and other problems that were different than oh, my children are the most precious thing on earth. And I don't say that in a whining way. I was kind of being a father. I'm of a generation where everything that my child does is one more exciting thing than another, and I'm so involved and want to know all her friends and where she's going and every single thing, and which is very fine, and my daughter feels loved, but probably annoyed. But I was raised with what I call benign neglect, which I'm really grateful for, because I kind of had to figure stuff out on my own, and if you don't have a car, how am I going to get to, the other end of the Sunset Strip to buy a bong. Well, I'm going to hitchhike. And I'm lucky to be alive, but I would get in the car with total strangers, and as long as I was alive by dinner, there was no problem.
Yeah.
And I kind of, that served me well of being, resourceful when I came to New York, at 18 and, had to get a job and figure, balance a checkbook and send out auditions. And, it was there was no, I wasn't reliant on my parents. It never occurred to me to share my woes about being unemployed as an actor or whatever was going on. I gratefully have a very open relationship with my daughter, and we do share each other's problems. So it's just different. But I kind of appreciate the style I was brought up in.
Yeah. No, it is very much of the time, right? You couldn't do that now. I'm not sure you should, but
Yeah, right.
also, we have just very few minutes left, but you write in a very sweet and sad way about your dad dying, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about what sort of the end there.
Well, my brother and I we never once had a discussion about his sexual preference or any of that. There was just no need. But on the day of the yard sale that I was talking about, my sister was there, and she was by that time establishing herself as an actress and was making money and was helping Dad out with money. And she brought along a young man who was older than her, but younger than my father. And his name is Norman, and he helped tag everything, and he was interference between the money, so Dad wouldn't have to haggle with the money. And Dominique watched this connection. And so she watched like a love story unfold right before her eyes. And she never told her brothers. And so some years go by, and my sister was strangled. And in the very first attempt, she escaped, and she went to Norman's house, quite hysterical. And she had scars, bruises on her neck, and Norman took pictures of them. And they were used in the trial a year later. And Norman, every day in this courtroom was a disaster, except for Norman's testimony. He just stood up and spoke and really conveyed, which no one else was, who Dominique was. And we were so proud and so happy. We always have lunch afterwards. And my father was oddly distant. Now, we didn't know they knew each other. And it was like Dad always came to our lunch, but when we had Norman come to lunch, Dad wasn't there. Flash forward, Dad is now quite advanced with prostate cancer. And so he goes to a experimental stem cell place in Germany. And so I go there to be with him. And I knock on the door of his room after I've dropped off my bags, and opens the door, and there's Norman. And Dad is kind of, he's pretty tired and fatigued. He's in bed. He's looking very hollow. And he just says, "Oh, you remember Norman from the trial? That was 30-something years earlier." Like, yeah. And so Dad goes to sleep. Or maybe pretends he goes to sleep. But Norman orders some wine from room service, and we go through a bottle or two of wine, and he recounts the entire history from the day of that garage sale. And he said, I know everything about you. I know when you got kicked out of school, your dad called me. And when your mom had MS. I was the first person he called. He was so worried about it. And with Dominique. And I've been with him, ever since. And when he was down and out, I helped him. And when I contracted HIV, he paid for my bills. And, we're celibate, we're long past all that, but we've always been in each other's lives. And Dad died not long afterwards and left Norman money in his will. And there was a memorial at St. Vincent Ferrer, and which Dad had been planning for. Like, it was a Broadway show.
And it was.
And all these prominent speakers came, but then Norman was on the program to read one of the passages from the Bible. And everybody is whispering, and who's that guy? Who's Norman? Who's Norman? And that was my dad's way of coming out.
All right, I can't think of a better ending than this. Thank you, Griffin Dunne.